In the previous 2 episodes I started dismantling this severely battery damaged Contax 137MA. The extent to which the alkaline electrolyte had spread even surprised me, with virtually every screw needing to be freed from its corroded home before any part could be removed. I'll put a link to part 1 on screen now, along with links down in the description. Following on from part 2, the lower chassis components have cleaned up nicely, the only casualty being the corroded contact from the mirror up switch. I'd like to get this assembly put back together before I start work on the shutter, so it's time to look at that switch. I've already measured it and drawn diagrams, so if the worst comes to the worst I can refabricate the entire unit, but I'm hoping to press out the remains of the corroded contact and replace it with a new piece of brass. How hard can it be? I've also cleaned off the corrosion from the good contact, of which there was a lot hiding beneath the bubbling plating. And lastly, to give myself a fighting chance, I've made a somewhat primitive holder to retain the plastic and hopefully protect the one remaining contact. So here goes. Actually, this is a job to do off camera, so I can see exactly what I'm doing. Well, that's not exactly how I expected it to go. There are these 2 holes running into the plastic block, and where the original contact passed through those holes, it was also corroded to almost nothing, so trying to push it out just collapsed what was left into those holes. However, I was able to drill out the remains with a pin vise and fine drill. Since then I've cut a strip of brass with the intention of using it to push out any remaining debris from the original contact slots. Fairly predictably, that strip folded over on itself after a bit of pushing. I had put a bit of a taper on the front end, and it may well be a bit too wide for the slots further along the strip. I'm now thinking that I might be able to drag it through from the tip, but I don't want to risk damaging the existing, more complex contact, so I might pull it back out, check its width, shaving off a bit if required, and then try again. As always, the tripod holding the video camera being completely in the way. And if you were expecting some fancy bit of milling machinery for this job, think again. A file and block of wood is all I'm using to shave about 1/4 millimetre off the brass. The resultant burr was removed with the back of my craft knife. Now to try again, but I'm fully expecting it to bend as I attempt to push it through the plastic, particularly with the tripod in the way this time. I realised when I reviewed this bit of footage that it wasn't exactly the best camera angle, but I'd set it up so I could work straight on to the path I was trying to push the contact through, rather than working at an angle. And that has gone pretty well. I can still drag the new contact through a little more, so the end that I folded over and straightened a few times can be cut off. At the moment the 2 contacts are touching. I'm not sure which contact needs bending a little, but that might become more obvious once I've mounted the switch in the chassis. Once I'm happy with the position, I'll fold over the rear end and solder on a separate piece to create the ground contact to the screw. And that's the replacement ground contact made. I'll get it soldered together before I trim off the excess from each end of the contact, and then I can get on with reassembling the gearbox. Well, that's it done. It'll never be as good as the original switch, and there's plenty of opportunity for it to cause future problems, particularly if the camera is left standing for months on end, at which point the plain brass contact could oxidise a bit, but it might just work. So on to the gearbox reassembly. The manual recommends oil for these 5 posts, and grease for the bearing shaft holes, along with these 2 posts. It doesn't mention the 2 idler gears, but clearly they will want lubrication, so I'll just use a drop of oil on those too. The oil they specify is Lunar or Lorna 40, which is a Japanese-made watch oil. I'll just use my go-to Mobius 8000 for that. And I didn't track down the HD9 grease, but I'll just use this grease that I bought years ago for similar-sized gearbox shafts. Don't ask me what it is, because it's long since lost its label and it's very dribbly, hence the tissue. I had been wondering how the camera prevented the motor from overdriving the gears once it had reached one of the limit switches. But once I'd looked at the gears, this first gear has a friction clutch built into it. This gear wasn't particularly affected by the corrosion, probably because it was packed with grease. I've no idea what type of grease it was, apart from it being dark grey, and it wasn't graphite grease. So for better or for worse, I'll try molybdenum grease and hope for the best. If it feels too slack after that, I'll wash it out and try something else. I won't film the entire reassembly of the gearbox. I'm sure you can all visualise how that would look. As with anything like this, a small amount of lubricant on each spindle or post is all that's needed. Over-oiling or greasing will just slow down the entire gearbox, which in this case would either lead to a reduction from the 3 frames per second wind speed, or the mirror not moving out of the way fast enough. Anyway, that's the first batch back in place. I can now grease up the bearing holes on the top plate and install that, before carrying on with the rest of this section. And here's that entire section reassembled. Everything is lubricated and moving nicely. I've set the switch contacts up with a small gap. I only adjusted the moving contact in the hopes that I hadn't disturbed the fixed contact, in which case it would be exactly where it was before. When I removed the motor, it only took a little pressure to rotate it, but the bearings were clearly tight, so I'll give that a bit of vinegar now and see if I can ease it without having to dismantle it, because it's definitely not designed to come apart. As always, that took far longer than I expected. I didn't want to flood the motor with vinegar, so I did a little at a time, flushing it with IPA after each vinegar treatment. Initially, not only was the motor tight on rotation, but also a better tell was the stiffness of the end float. Finally, after much work, that's nice and free, and the motor runs nice and quietly on a single AA battery, as against the 4 that will power it when it's in the camera. So that's ready to go back in the chassis, which can then sit on one side until it's needed. Actually, before I put that away, let's have a look at how it works. When you go to take a photograph, the motor rotates clockwise, which pushes on this spring-loaded lever or pawl, which in turn moves the aperture stop-down lever. When the switch that I repaired earlier closes, the motor will stop turning. At the same time, the other end of the lower lever will move this lever on the side plate, which raises the mirror. When the mirror is fully up, it triggers the release lever, the top end of which flicks this lever on the shutter assembly, which I believe is the first curtain latch. Then the release of the second curtain will be done electronically, and I guess that's where the eccentric screw comes into play on the side plate. This will adjust the time at which the camera sees that the first curtain has been released, thereby correcting for timing errors at high shutter speeds. Once the shot has been taken, the motor will rotate anti-clockwise, lowering the mirror and opening the aperture. At the same time, the shutter itself will be recocked using the gearing in the top gearbox, and the cam on the nylon gear down here will move this bottom lever, which in turn will recock the release lever on the side plate. The cam follower on that bottom lever is spring-loaded, so it will just flick out of the way when it rotates in the opposite direction to raise the mirror. Thusly. So next it's onto the shutter assembly, and this is where it could get more complicated. Usually I would observe the operation of this before I started dismantling anything, so I had a good idea of what did what. But as everything is all corroded solid, I'll just have to strip it all apart and deal with all the critical settings of the shutter later on when I reassemble the thing. Normally I'd want to slacken the springs for the shutter curtains first. I usually count how many revolutions of preload are on each curtain, but as always the shafts are seized solid. I can loosen the curtains themselves, but the springs on the drums will still be under tension. I won't necessarily go through every component that I take off this section in the video, but I will be noting them all in my disassembly notes. So I'll start off with this post at the rear. I've already removed the lacquer or glue that was keeping this nut from rattling loose. Then I'll remove the rest of the components in order and rejoin you once they're off. Right, most of that lot has simply lifted off, but the lever at the bottom is seized in place, so it's time for the vinegar. Just look at it fizz. And that's now moving, so it can come off along with the spring beneath and join its buddies in the vinegar. Next will be the second curtain latch. This is held in place with one of those annoying grippy clips. It doesn't sit in a groove like a C-clip, it just grips onto the post. So as ever, I'll remove that off camera and then look at the lever itself. Actually, I will show the removal of this clip. My normal method is to ease a suitable size screwdriver between the prongs to release the tension on the post, and then gently persuade the clip off using a second screwdriver. And if all goes to plan, the clip remains on the end of the first screwdriver. Thusly. As always, the lever is very much seized to its post, so it's back to the vinegar again, and I get the feeling that this one might be difficult to free off. And I was right, so it's more heating with the soldering iron, and vinegar, and IPA, and then repeat, before finally adding some oil. But it still won't budge, so while I'm waiting for that, I'll remove this switch from the front of the assembly before it gets damaged. And still more waiting, so I'll remove the transfer switch and get the screws and brackets cleaned up. I may have to come up with a plan B regarding freeing up the second curtain latch, because it just won't free off at the moment. Persistence, that's all it needed. A few more heat cycles and oil, and now it moves. Not quite free enough to lift off the post, but it's nearly there. Well, that was fun. I think I could have made a whole video of me attempting to remove this lever, and wouldn't that make thrilling viewing? So, on to the next part, which is the screw in the centre of the shutter shaft. This one is a left-hand thread, and rather handily it's nice and free to remove, possibly due to all the vinegar, heat and oil from the last section, not forgetting the plane washer situated beneath said screw. The next section is where things can go wrong, because many of the parts will need to be readjusted correctly if the shutter is actually going to work. I will be scribing alignment marks on many parts as I go, so at least I've got a reasonable starting point when I reassemble the camera. There's a brake pin here and another lock screw opposite it. These lock down the disc beneath, which can be adjusted to set the start position of the second curtain. There's some waffle in the service manual that will hopefully make sense when I come to reassemble it, otherwise it'll just be the usual trial and error until the thing works correctly. As before, I'd made sure these were free to move before filming this clip, otherwise we'd end up with, in today's episode, GrumpyTim removes a screw, which might have some appeal as an ASMR video, but that's not exactly what I was going for. At this stage, I think this gear beneath the adjustable plate should just lift off, but how incredibly unusual, it's corroded in place. Now where's the vinegar? Just look at it fizz. Maybe I should get some GrumpyTim t-shirts made with that motto emblazoned on the front. Well, it's off, along with the plane washer beneath it, but looking at the parts diagram, the central brass tube should also be free, so I'll dunk it in the vinegar for a while to see if it will free off at all. While that's soaking in the vinegar, I'll look at the next section. To get the first curtain gear out, I'll need to remove this braking assembly, which appears to consist of a nut and a spring, along with a couple of levers and probably some washers too. So I'll start that off with some vinegar before I attempt to move it. There's a slot in the top of the threaded post, so presumably the whole thing screws into the section beneath. The nut at the top is also thread locked or lacquered in place, so I'll clean that off before attempting to move the nut. In the grand scheme of things, that all came apart fairly easily, although there's a thicker brass washer still stuck in place, so I'll let that fizz for a while first. The second curtain start plate gear has been in the vinegar for well over an hour, but I still can't budge the brass tube that runs through it, so it's time for more heat, along with maybe a bit of IPA, and vinegar, and more IPA, and finally oil, which will hopefully be sucked into the gaps as the thing cools. And after many more heat cycles it still won't budge, so I'll probably leave it in brake fluid or something like that for a few days to see if I can get any joy that way. And as a later thought, although the bushing is pictured as a separate part, I now suspect that it's a sintered brass bushing which is pressed into the gear, and it was never intended to move, so going on that basis I'll just oil it up and let it be as it is. Anyway, I have managed to remove the thick brass washer from the braking assembly post. What the manual didn't show is that the hole in the washer is undersized, being clamped down by the post itself. So with that tiny little win, I'm going to end this video. I'll try to bring you some more exciting progress in the next episode, or I could just film some paint drying. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you don't miss out on the next thrilling episode. That's it for now, so thanks for watching and I'll see you in a future video.